Well, I have to go back to Southwest days to tell you how Grace Baptist got started. My husband, Harlan, was working there at Southwest Baptist. In 1976, the year before Grace Baptist was started, at the end of that year, he had this unrest in his heart, and we didn't know what it was, and he couldn't determine what was happening. He wondered if it was the Lord speaking to him, but he didn't know what to do about it. Well, in June of the next year, 10 months later, we were sleeping, and all at once in the middle of the night, Harlan said, "Francie, Francie." And I said, "What is wrong?" And he said, "I've got to preach. I have to preach. The Lord's leading me to preach." And my first thought was, my first words were, "Thank God," because we had gone through all this, almost a year of this, wondering what in the world was wrong. And so we made preparations to get in the ministry as a pastor. So that's what we did. Only this time we moved to Tulsa, to the north side of Tulsa, and we found two families that wanted to start a church in North Tulsa. We all had the same heart, we were all on the same page, and we just wanted to start a good church in North Tulsa. So we talked and prayed and talked and prayed and finally came up with a name of Grace Baptist Church. After that, Harlan began to try to find a place to meet. And we found a building on 60th Street North, and it was empty. And we rented the building for the first couple of months from Brother Bonner.
I was attending a church at Admiral Garnett, riding the bus to save gas and everything. And it is an independent Baptist church, and I enjoyed the teaching and all the services, but I wasn't involved. A missionary came one day and asked us to pray for a month of an impossible situation. And my impossibility was having a church close to my house.
Well, Harlan and I had walked up and down the streets there in North Tulsa, knocking doors, inviting people.
One night, Brother Harlan and Francie came by and invited me to their church. And I went that next Sunday, and it turned out to be the same kind of church, 1 block from my house. I enjoyed the whole service and everything, and so I continued to go there.
We had our first Sunday on October 2nd, 1977. And then the next January, we had Brother Darty come from our church in Illinois to preach the organization service. And so he came out, and he brought us a bus with him, and so we could start a bus ministry.
Brother Harlan's had his station wagon to pick up kids, and he'd load that thing just as tight as he could. I don't think there was any belt seat deals there at that point, because they would load that station wagon just as far as it could, maybe 2 trips. And his church in Illinois sent us a bus that we could use, because we were like a missionary church off of their church. When I came there, Francie was teaching beginners all the way to 6th grade. And so they needed a teacher for 2 to 5-year-olds. And so I took that class.
But one very important thing that Harlan did right there at the beginning was to get involved in missions. We slowly grew. We had Faith Promise every Sunday, and the attendance kept growing. We were there in that rented building on North Peoria for 1 year, and Harlan led the church to buy the 15 acres on the corner of 75 and 96th Street North. By this time, Derek had come on board as associate. He worked with his dad for 3 years. In the middle of all that, El Reno Bible Baptist in El Reno, Oklahoma, wanted Harlan to come candidate for pastor. Here we are in the middle of living in a rented building, and we have this property that needs a church built on it. And he leaves the church.
Dad pastored for those first few years. In 1985, he went to El Reno, and to my surprise, they wanted us to stay. It really was a surprise. We were young and didn't have a lot of experience at it, but they wanted us to stay, and so we decided that the best way for us to finance it would be through a bond program.
We had bonds to sell so that we could buy the church. A man came, and they were good interest because it was like 15 down to about 8%. And we were to go out and sell the bonds to anybody we knew.
We scavenged and we begged friends and family to buy those church bonds.
It was a miracle because we finished a lot, probably 10 years early on those bonds, paying them back.
So we sold those bonds and we could go ahead and start, if I recall right. It was a lot like the Three Stooges building that building. Without any exaggeration, my youth and the guys in the church were willing. There wasn't very many of us, and we didn't have very many skill sets when it comes to that. So we just kind of mangled our way through it. Don and Gerald and Harold and a couple other guys, and my brother Darren and I were the ones that were there pretty much I was able to be there through the daytime. They'd come evenings when they could, and then we worked every Saturday. It seemed like for 3 decades, but obviously it wasn't that long, but it seemed like it, trying to get it done. And I just admired those guys so much because of the sacrifice, and it was really hard during that time, and we just couldn't have done it without them. I don't know why Brother Harold would bring these cans of peanuts every week, though. And every time we worked, he would bring cans of peanuts. And I think the reason it took so long is because the peanuts were sitting here, and it didn't matter where you were working. If you needed to go here, there was always this trip by these peanuts every time. And all the guys that worked there, it was a big joke every time.
The first church was pink and mauve, and I chose blue, but nobody wanted blue. We painted it many times and worked on it many times, and everybody's shared in the building of it.
From the selling of those bonds to the meager resource that we had, to the guys that, from my experience in youth and, foolishness and all that, and all of that, we got to experience God do some really cool things.
Derek and Shelley did great. They were there 7 years, and he felt he should resign in the fall of 1992. And so we had been at El Reno for 7 years, like he had been at Grace for 7 years to pastor. So they called Harlan again. They needed a pastor, and they asked him if he would be interested in coming back. And so like he always did, he prayed about it. He felt in his heart that was the thing to do. So we went back to Grace. We were there another 5.5 years, and that was a sweet ministry too, until Harlan's health started failing. But it was a wonderful ministry at Grace both times.
During that period of transition, God opened up the door for us to minister at Grace Baptist Church because they were looking for an interim pastor until they would call someone. We ministered there for approximately 2 months, and they came back to me and asked me if I would be interested in taking the pastorate. My wife and I prayed about it, and we sought counsel concerning it, and the church called us. I became pastor, and my wife became church secretary. The primary thought that comes to my mind concerning our time at Grace would be their graciousness. The bond that we had at Grace, I'm persuaded, had everything to do with the labor for the Lord that God's people had together. About 3 years into the ministry at Grace Baptist Church, the Clausen family felt led of the Lord to join.
But one of the things that I felt led of very young was a call to the ministry. I didn't know what all that call would entail, but I do believe it was a call to serve the Lord in some capacity in full-time ministry.
Well, I grew up in the church. I started attending when I was 5 with my grandparents. Actually, they started bringing us, and then it transitioned to the van route, picking my sister and I up before my mom became regular attender. Brother Brent was actually our van driver at the time, and I remember being a little girl and asking him, when I'm older and I grow up, do you think the church will still be in business? And so even to this day, that's kind of one of our jokes that we have. And it was during that time of being in the youth department that I really surrendered to the Lord. So after I surrendered, and the Lord had solidified in my heart that I needed to go to Heartland and attend Heartland Baptist Bible College.
So I went to Heartland, went in 2008 in the fall, and pursued a pastoral degree, all the while believing God was probably going to lead me back to my home church, but I didn't know for sure.
There came a point in time when I realized that our ministry was finishing at Grace. Realizing that and sharing that with the men of the church, I instructed them as to some of the steps that needed to take place as far as calling another pastor. In doing so, I just said, you have someone here that I'm persuaded you need to consider.
Brother Field had mentioned to me privately that he felt led that I would become the pastor. However, they needed to go through the candidation process. Long story short, it was unanimous when they came and called me as pastor, and I was very thankful for the gracious spirit of the people, because here I was at 24 years old, pastoring your home church, and people that knew you as little Zach are fumbling around like I am trying to call you pastor.
We always thought it would be one of the hardest places to go back to minister would be our home church, but it's also one of the most rewarding places because nobody cares more about the people or the community. Church isn't just a place that you go to, but it's a family that you belong to, and it really is that way here at Grace.
When you go into a church and you sit down and you want to start going to church there, and you look around at the nice building and the nice pews and everything that's in place, we need to really thank God for those that have started that, and that everything's in place for you to build on.
You hardly ever can duplicate those times, and Grace has a really special place in our hearts, and the people there, you know, are just like us, just ordinary people, and for something to last for 40 years speaks to a lot of good people being faithful.
I can look back now and with a full heart say that I am extremely grateful that God called us to Grace. There are things that God did in our lives there that only He could have done in that place with those people.
Being a pastor, I've learned a lot. But the main thing that I've learned is that this is not my church, this is God's church. For 40 years, God has shown His grace here at Grace Baptist Church. And that theme has continued year after year for 4 decades now. The only way that we'll be able to continue as a church is if we continue in God's grace. And we don't need another standard. We don't need another book. We need to continue preaching the Word of God and letting the Word of God change lives. We need to continue soul winning and knocking doors, seeing people come to the knowledge of Jesus Christ through evangelism and outreach efforts. We need to continue running bus and van routes and seeing those young kids come in and hear the gospel and have their lives change as well. We need to continue having VBS. And so all those things add up to just giving God the glory, because it's not what we have done. It's not in our efforts. We've just been here because of God's grace, and every result that we've seen is just a continuation of God's grace. And if there's anything I can encourage you, church, to do, is just continue in the grace of God, not just for tomorrow, not just for next year, but for the next 40 years. And looking forward into the Lord's return. But until then, we've got a lot of work to do. I'm thankful to be a part of it.